Hello, hello, hello. Welcome, everyone, to this live manuscript repair and rewrite with Jerry Jenkins, 21-time New York Times best-selling author of over 200 books. Jerry, I'm going to let some people trickle into this room. People are diving in. We got over 100 people already here, and I'm sure this will keep going up as we get started here. But as a reminder, this is something that we usually reserve for Guild members. That's people who have signed up for the Jerry Jenkins Writers Guild. But we wanted to share it a little more broadly here, just in an effort to share that expertise that you've developed over these many, many years of your writing career. And as you dive in, we'll be doing both a nonfiction and a fiction manuscript, because as you know, and as the listener knows, Jerry, you've had success in both of those fields and have unique insights on what's working and what's working now, especially. So let's go ahead and get started. But before we do, one last announcement. We are going to do a question and answer time at the end of this manuscript repair and rewrite session. So open up that Q&A box on your Zoom window and put your questions in there. And Jerry, you and I will get to just as many as possible after you go through these manuscripts and show us really what we need to know about becoming a ruthless self-editor. And with that, Jerry, if you'll just give a few words of welcome, we can dive right in.
Thanks, Chase. Yeah, welcome to everybody. This is always a fun session. These manuscript repair and rewrite sessions are really the most popular training I do. I hear from people all over the world who say that finally someone is telling me what's wrong with my manuscript and how I can fix it and give it the best chance to sell. Editing like this, I'm a pretty heavy editor, and I really believe in brevity. I'm what's considered a minimalist. I try to cut. Cutting almost always adds power. And so you may hear some terms today that you aren't familiar with. Write those down, get them in the question box so that we can talk about them later. I'm going to try to speed through two samples here today, and leave at least a half hour for Q&A. The first one is a nonfiction sample. What I do is I do a heavy edit and rewrite of the first page of a submission. And we got lots of submissions this time, several hundred. And so we sort of picked at random. It isn't necessarily that these are the best or the worst. They're just things that I think can be very instructive when you see what we do. And Chase mentioned being a ferocious self-editor. You're going to see what ferocious editing is. There's a lot of blood on these pages. I try to be straightforward without being blunt. I don't want to be a Simon Cowell and only criticize, but I do owe it to you to be straightforward and say, look, I've been doing this. I had my first book published 50 years ago this year, so I was 2 when I started, and I've actually been a professional writer since I was 14. I was a sports writer at age 14, so I've been doing this a long time, and I edit my own stuff the same way. Now, admittedly, the longer you write, the less editing you have to do, but you always should be willing to do the most ferocious editing you can. So let's bring up the first sample. I'm going to share my screen after I get these up here. Here we go. And the very first one, I just have to find it. There it is. Let me read you the original. I know you can read too, but just so you can get the thing here. What I do is I read it through, and then I'm going to show you the edited version. It's going to have a lot of hen scratchings on it, cross-outs and additions. And then we're going to look at the final version, the clean version. And this is subjective. Not all editors will edit exactly the same way, but they do have the same principles. And you'll see what some of those are. So this is a nonfiction sample, and it reads like this. Summer 1972. I'm 9.5. We are at an airport in Spain. Emotions are coming off my father in turbulent waves. I can see he is drowning. Our flight is called, and now we are being funneled along by pairs of hands. Not my father's. He hasn't moved. There's no time. I look back at him. Tears are streaming down his face. That was the first time I saw my father cry, and it shook me deeply. In that moment, I knew two things. The situation was bad, and there was no way of knowing how long we would all be scattered so brutally apart. No way of knowing. My brother is 8, boisterous, big for his age, and with a tough stutter. My sister is 15 months old. We are on our own. My brother and I are seated on the plane together. My sister given to a lady we met at the airport and is in a different section of the plane. I don't like it. There was fussing and coloring books. We were given drinks we weren't allowed at home with straws. Sad smiles all around. Sad smiles surround us. As we took off, I remember my mind being in the strangest in between. The responsibility I felt for my siblings was sharp and enormous, but the red blur of the night before was taking me far, far away from my body, and I was happy to go. It had been the last night of the holiday, a lovely villa close to the beach. My parents were both 36 and had gone out to eat and dance. At the end of the evening, they had quarreled. My mother opted to walk back along the warm, starlit beach, and my father came back to the villa. Early the next morning, my brother shakes me awake, saying, "Mum's dead, Mum's dead." I push past him in a sleep-laden daze. Outside our room, I meet a scene of utter carnage. I've never seen so much blood before. I could tell someone had crawled or was dragged. There are flailing red handprints on the stark whitewashed walls, and the pretty upholstered armchair that my mom had made it to is a ruby throne of horror, but she isn't dead. All right, this has a lot of good things going for it. In spite of the fact that it's nonfiction, it still does the things that novels do well, and that's plunge your main character into terrible trouble as soon as possible. This is very evocative. It's very graphic. But I think there's a lot of ways this can be helped as well. And so let's take a look. I'm going to stop sharing that. I'm going to start sharing the edited version. And as I said, you're going to see a lot of hand scratchings here. First of all, this needs a title, and Summer 1972 is not the title. It really serves as a location and date tag, so it should be flush left and in italics. And then where it says, "I'm 9.5, we are," that's passive. Anytime you can eliminate state of being verbs, we all know what state of being verbs are. Is, am, are, was, were, be, being, been, has, have, had, do, does, did. They go on. We memorized these in junior high or high school. And if you haven't, you can easily Google them, state of being verbs. We need them. They're often we use state of being verbs, but the more you can cut out and go to active verbs, the better. So instead of "we are at an airport," for one thing, you want to be specific, especially in nonfiction. Just say, "I'm 9.5 at," and then say Spain's and the name of the airport. And then again, we're passive. Emotions are coming. Emotion seems to gush from my father. I like turbulent waves, but it seems a little eloquent for a 9-year-old. And then the original had a comma splice. If you don't know what that is, we don't really have time to get into that today. But look it up. A comma splice basically is when you use a comma where you should have used a period or a semicolon. I'm not real fond of semicolons. They're a little formal for me. I think you'd want a period there if you were going to use it in the original form. "I can see he is drowning." That's telling. I'd rather let the reader deduce this. And by saying that emotion seems to gush from my father, that shows us that that he's drowning and that he's in trouble. Our flight is called, that goes without saying, and it's passive, is called. You're at an airport, you're being hustled onto a plane. You don't need to say the flight was called. We know that. So all this can continue with, instead of "and now my brother and sister and I are being," that's passive too. Just say, "as my 8-year-old brother and 15-month-old sister and I are funneled along by pairs of hands." Not my father's. Again, we can eliminate the semicolon there, go to a period. Not my father's. He hasn't moved. There's no time. That's kind of vague and off point. We get it. You're being hustled onto a plane. And you've already established. You don't have to say you look back at him, because if tears are streaming down his face, we know you're looking at him. But you've already established that because the emotion's gushing from him. This is the first time I've seen. Now, here, you've changed tenses. You've got a present tense thing happening here, which I think works. It lends immediacy to this story. But then you go to "that was." Don't change tenses until the flashback. Say, "This is the first time I've seen my father cry, and it shakes me." Don't need the "deeply." Shakes, does the work. Don't start in that moment. That's slow. Everything's happening in this moment. And then I knew two things. All of this is stuff that you know. We don't need to be told that. Just say this, you stay in present tense, this is bad. And there's no way of knowing how long we kids will be apart from him. Need a space between way and of here, but I kind of like this touch of the period after each word. It shows the drama of it, no way of knowing. I think I didn't want to be surprised by the brother's age. That's why I moved that up higher. So we go to my brother, big for his age and boisterous, with a bad stutter, a tough stutter. I'm not quite sure what that means. I think it means bad. And then my sister's 15 months, so we were on our own. That's telling. Give the reader credit. We know we're getting this. You're being separated from your father. So he sits beside me on the plane while my sister sits elsewhere with a lady we met at the airport. Just tightening this up. You don't need all these words here. I don't like it. There is fussing and coloring books. We can use the British spelling of coloring because this is set in a different country. And I'm assuming maybe you're from one of the British Commonwealth countries. And instead of we were given to say, in drinks, we aren't allowed at home. So there's fussing and coloring books. Drinks aren't allowed at home. The straws thing, I think, is irrelevant. Sad smiles surround us. And then this is really kind of slow and telling. We're with you. As we took off, I remember my mind being in the strangers in between. We get it. We don't need to be told that. And then the responsibility felt, just say I feel a sharp and enormous responsibility for my siblings, especially since the red blur the night before. That's a really nice touch, by the way, the red blur. And then was taking me far, far away from my body, and I was happy to go. That's unneeded. It's also a little puzzling. Why would you want to go back to that horrible scene? I get it that you want to be far away from your body because this is a trauma, but not necessarily that you want to go back to that. And then now you can change to past tense because you're talking about what happened. Instead of it had been, just say, on the last night of our family holiday in a lovely villa close to the beach, my parents, and I think it's irrelevant how old they were. We can guess their approximate age by the age of you and your siblings, had gone out to eat and dance. At the end of the evening, they had quarreled. This is a nice setup that demands a payoff, but we do need to know how you learned this. At some point later in the story, maybe you'll talk about that your father filled you in. And my mother opted to walk along. We want to avoid the echo of back here, back along and back to the villa. So my mother opted to walk along the warm starlit beach as my father came back to the villa. Early the next morning, my brother shook, stay in past tense now, shook me awake. Don't need to say saying, just quote him. You've already, once you use an action beat that establishes who's going to speak, we know. You do need the apostrophe here, as you did the second time he says mom's dead. You need it in both of those. Mom's dead, mom's dead. I would put an exclamation point after both of those. I pushed, use past is the wrong word. You want P-A-S-T there. I pushed past him. We assume you're sleep laden. You've just been awakened. And you don't need to say outside or around. You push past him in a daze to utter carnage. I'd never seen so much blood. We don't need the before. I could tell as unneeded. You don't need to say someone. It's clear who it was. She had crawled or was dragged, leaving red handprints on the stark whitewashed walls. Mom had made it to a pretty upholstered armchair that became a ruby throne of horror. As I say, that's a nice touch there, but she wasn't dead. All right, I would keep reading this, but you see how much cutting and tightening I've done. I'm already pushing up against my time here, so let me just show you the clean version. Oops, got the wrong one. I'll be back.
No worries. And this is a live session, guys. As a reminder, we're going to take some questions at the end. So be sure to throw them in that question and answer box as we continue forward with this edited version of this nonfiction piece.
All right, let me read this real fast and we'll jump into the fiction sample. Summer 1972, I'm 9.5 at Spain's whatever airport. Emotion seems to gush from my father as my 8-year-old brother and 15-month-old sister and I are funneled along by pairs of hands. Not my father's. He hasn't moved. This is the first time I've seen my father cry, and it shakes me. This is bad, and there's no way of knowing how long we kids will be apart from him. No way of knowing. My brother, big for his age and boisterous with a bad stutter, sits beside me on the plane, while my sister sits elsewhere with a lady we met at the airport. I don't like it. There is fussing and coloring books and drinks we aren't allowed at home. Sad smiles surround us. I feel a sharp and enormous responsibility for my siblings, especially since the red blur of the night before. On the last night of our family holiday in a lovely villa close to the beach, my parents had gone out to eat and dance. At the end of the evening, they had quarreled, and my mother opted to walk along the warm, starlit beach as my father came back to the villa. Early the next morning, my brother shook me awake. Mum's dead, Mum's dead. I forgot the ending quote marks there. See, I still edit myself as on the fly. I pushed past him in a daze to utter carnage. I might rewrite that sentence. It isn't a daze to utter carnage. It's I pushed past him to utter carnage, maybe in a daze. Switch that. You just kind of change as you go. I'd never seen so much blood. She had crawled or was dragged, leaving red handprints on the stark whitewashed walls. Mum had made it to a pretty upholstered armchair that became a ruby throne of horror, but she wasn't dead. All right, lots of stuff to talk about there. Hopefully that raised a lot of questions and we can get to those. Let me jump right into the fiction sample.
Outstanding. Yeah, Jerry, it really did. And we'll have some more, I'm sure, coming up after this fiction piece.
Let me, there it is. Oh, that's the nonfiction. I'm having trouble finding number one here. Let me go to my Word file.
You have some people in the comments, Jerry, as you're looking for that are also editing on the fly alongside of you. So people are really engaging with this content.
Great. Let me look for number one. Number one is there. No, number 4 is what I want. There it is. All right, here's the fiction sample. Chapter 1, Shades of Madness. Cassie Woods rubbed sleep from her eyes within the monochromatic hues of 4 a.m. The water-stained ceiling made her dizzy as each moment spiraled into the next. Why did she survive the car accident and Grandma didn't? Last year's drama plaque reflected the faint alarm clock light. She rose from the twin bed, removed it from the wall, and ran her thumb across the engraving. Her name and 1991 etched across the cast bronze. She received it when she was a junior, the night of the accident. Footsteps shuffled down the stairs. Cassie knocked her glasses onto the floor when she set the plaque on the nightstand. In the darkness, she accidentally stepped on the wire frames. Now they fit lopsided on her face. A cabinet thumped underfoot. When she snuck to the door, the metal bed frame scraped her leg. She sucked in a curse word and examined the cut in the shaft of the moonlight from the hall. It was hot to the touch, but didn't bleed. When the silverware drawer clanged, she crept down the narrow staircase to investigate. The hunter green living room carpet was vacuumed into neat rows like sprouts of Indiana corn, stopping at the kitchen entry. Each room was separated by double pocket doors as if life could be compartmentalized into 4 tidy boxes. The living room, the kitchen, the dining room, and the sitting room. A closet-sized bathroom, an afterthought smashed between the stairwell and kitchen. Everything had a place in this house, including Cassie. Her dad stood by the kitchen counter, his back to her, browsing the front page of the rain-soaked paper. His dark hair matched the steamy pot of coffee in hand. "Good morning," she said. All right, some interesting stuff here. One of the things is there's a cliche here. It's a situational cliche, and it's been used so many times. You want to see if you can avoid it, and that is starting a story with somebody waking up. Now, usually they wake up to an alarm clock, and they knock it on the floor, and they walk past a full-length mirror and describe themselves. Those are the cliches. I don't mind this starting with her, waking up in the middle of the morning, because there's something that's bothering her, and we've avoided the alarm clock thing. There are some other things I do think we want to avoid. Well, there was one place where there was a comma that didn't. It was hot to the touch but didn't bleed. You don't need a comma there because but didn't bleed is not a full clause in itself. There's also some confusing things when it says footsteps shuffled down the stairs. I'm assuming you mean that's her. But then you go back to say she knocked her glasses off on the floor and stepped on them, and now they're lopsided. That stuff is evocative, but it doesn't really move your story along. It's what we refer to as on-the-nose writing. It might mirror real life, but it doesn't advance the story. So let me show you how we do that in the editing. And that's going to be number 5. And there it is. Some minor formatting issues. You want to center your chapter number and title. So chapter 1 will be on its own line. And delete the dash there, and then Shades of Madness. And then 1 double space down from the title, start your thing. Rub sleep from her eyes is a cliche. Within the monochromatic hues of 4 a.m., I prefer you just say it. The music here is that she's awakened in the middle of the night or in the wee hours of the morning. And that subtly reveals her angst over this, plagued by why she had survived. I wouldn't say car accident this early. Let that emerge. For one thing, she wouldn't be thinking car accident. She knows this. She has a full memory of this because she survived and her grandma didn't. So the accident, that's what's on her mind. And the reader will intuitively realize, they'll learn later what this accident's all about. And then on the wall, last year's drama award plaque reflected her faint alarm clock light. So we get a picture of the setting here. She rose from the twin bed, removed it from the wall. That sounds like she's removing the bed from the wall, which is not what you want, and then ran her thumb across the engraving. But there's too much going on here anyway, and there's no need for her to do this. I realize why you're doing it is to establish that she's in high school, and last year was her junior year. She won this award, and it kind of sets the scene. But just say it. I think the music of this is the fact that she's woken up in the middle of the night, and that she has this angst, and of course she's going to hear things downstairs. She'd won it as a junior in 1991. That helps establish, her age. And then these irrelevant details. We're with you, and we can deduce this. We don't need all this etched across the bronze. I moved up the thing about being a junior. The night of the accident. That's a nice informative touch. So that's why she is noticing the plaque and why we're being shown it. And then instead of footsteps shuffled downstairs, just say at what sounded like the opening and closing of the silverware drawer in the kitchen. That's what she hears. She crept downstairs. And then the thing about her glasses, knocking them on the floor, that does establish that she wears glasses. Maybe you can do that when she gets downstairs. Maybe she pushes them up on her nose or something. Or her father mentions her glasses or something. But all this stuff about stepped on them, for one thing, we're doing a flashback and the story has just started. And accidentally stepped on them, now they fit lopsided. It really slows the story. And as I say, you can establish that later. I think the cabinet thumping underfoot is unneeded. And then when she snuck to the door of the metal frame, scraped her leg, she sucked in a curse word, examined it. Again, this is trivia that's slowing the story. And then we realize here the silverware drawer clanged. That's what you could actually hear upstairs, I think. And then go right to the hunter green living room carpet had been vacuumed in neat rows. I don't think you need sprouts of like corn, like Indiana corn. Stopping at the kitchen, we don't need entry. Each room is separated by pocket doors. This is a nice little touch here. Don't need to spoon feed every detail. If you list 4 things, we know there's 4. We don't need to have you tell us. And then just keep it tight. Tidy boxes, living room, kitchen, dining room, sitting room. Don't think you need the bathroom. We're going to assume they have indoor plumbing. Everything had a place in this house, including Cassie. That's a really nice touch. And that's the reason you sort of describe the setting. And then her dad stood by the kitchen counter. His back to her. If his back is, if I said that wrong. I should say if his back is to her, she wouldn't see what he's doing. She might see that he's got the paper, but she wouldn't know necessarily what he's doing. Knew she did were in her head, not his. So you can't say unequivocally what he's doing. You can say it looks like he's scanning the paper, but anyway, the rain-soaked newspaper in one hand, steamy pot of coffee in the other, matching the color of his hair. Good morning, she said. Now, normally I would suggest just saying that she greeted him, because you don't need to, you want to paraphrase a banal conversation like good morning and how are you and what's new, nothing, how about you, and then get to the point. Just say they greeted each other and then this happened. But this is sort of how she announces her presence. Now, by now, we're desperate for the story. It's been nicely and quickly set up by her waking angst. And so perhaps the conversation with her father will add details to the accident. I hope so. All right, let's take a look at the clean version, and then we'll have a good half hour for Q&A. So I'm looking for the clean one. There it is. Notice how much shorter this is, but it's the same story in the same order, same words, just fewer of them. Cutting almost always adds power. Chapter 1, Shades of Madness. Cassie Woods awoke in the wee hours of the morning, again plagued by why she had survived the accident and Grandma hadn't. That's a nice setup. The reader knows intuitively we're going to learn what this is all about. On the wall, last year's drama award plaque reflected her faint alarm clock light. She'd won it as a junior in 1991, the night of the accident. At what sounded like the opening and closing of the silverware drawer in the kitchen, she crept downstairs. The hunter green living room carpet had been vacuumed into neat rows like Indiana corn, stopping at the kitchen. Each room was separated by double pocket doors, as if life could be compartmentalized into tidy boxes. Living room, kitchen, dining room, and sitting room. Everything had a place in this house, including Cassie. Her dad stood by the kitchen counter, his back to her, the rain-soaked newspaper in one hand, a steamy pot of coffee in the other, matching the color of his hair. Good morning, she said. I would keep reading that, and it's tight, and it doesn't have a lot of the extraneous details. So I hope that was helpful. I'm sure it raised a lot of questions, but I think we're done sharing.
Jerry, that was awesome. And we'll dive right into some questions, but I do want to just acknowledge that some of us are sitting here, and to Sarah's point in the question and answer box, she says it's like standing in a rather wonderful fire hose of info, brain too busy to form a question. I agree, Sarah. Absolutely. But you know what? We're going to dive into some that folks have put into the question and answer box. And if you have a question, feel free to add it to the question and answer box as well. We'll get to just as many as we can over the next 30 minutes. And I want to start, Jerry, with an anonymous attendee. So a little intrigue there. But here she says, thanks for this session. How do you properly add in a character's internal conflict dialogue without slowing down the scene's pacing?
Good question. I think, for one thing, if you render the scene accurately, you don't need to do a lot of explaining of the internal conflict. I often use this example. Say a young mother is at home alone at night with a 1-year-old baby upstairs in the crib. Her husband works nights. She hears a noise in the basement. Being a mother bear, being protective, she creeps to the basement door, opens it a little bit, and sees a shadow of a man moving behind the furnace. Now, the amateur is going to say her heart raced and thudded in her chest, and her mouth went dry, and her fingers were shaking, and she was terrified. And do we need to be told that? We should be feeling that. We put ourselves in the place of that mother, and we just watch the scene unfold. There's somebody down there. Does she just quickly try to call her husband? Does she try to call the police? She notices the aluminum bat on the stairs that her husband, a softball player, leaves there. She grabs that bat and starts creeping down the stairs. And we're going, no, don't do that. But do we need to be told all those internal conflict, dialogue, etc.? That's what slows the scene's pacing. So be very judicious about that. Another example I use very quickly is a girl who's been jilted at the altar. Her father's walking her down the aisle and the groom is not there. And they're thinking, it's just a glitch. He's tying a shoe. He'll be there. And then clearly he's not there. The father has to announce to the assembled guests, we'll still have the reception. You can take your gifts back. Clearly there's a problem here. She runs out of the church, goes to the car. Dad drives her home. She goes back up to the bedroom she thought she'd left forever. Do we need to be told of sobbing and tears filling the pillow and, banging on the bed? I'd rather see her just lean her back against the wall and slide down to a sitting position. Her mother comes up to talk to her. She just waits, like, not now. We know what she's going through. We don't need to be told all this stuff. So show rather than tell, and ignite or trigger the theater of the reader's mind. Give the reader a role in the reading experience. Don't speed them everything.
Yeah, that's really good. Jerry, we have another question along a similar line from Magdalena. She says, how do you properly portray a period of healing without making the reality of the slow process boring and monotone, but also not too fast? So another pacing question.
Yeah, and that's a tricky part. That's what makes us authors, Magdalena. Oftentimes I get to a place in a book where somebody has suffered a trauma, and it only makes sense. It's going to take them 6 months to heal before they can act again. Well, we don't want 30, 40, 50 pages to cover that 6 months of them sitting around or going to counseling or praying or whatever they do. I would say you could summarize it fairly quickly, but still make it obvious that months have passed. You might even start by, after the trauma has happened, have your next section start with a date tag that says 3 months later, he or she, whoever your character is, has finally been able to get up in the morning without this being the first thing on their mind. And then maybe a paragraph or two of how they've kind of trying to get back into life. They've gone to the gym or they've gone back to work or they've, whatever it is. You can do this in less than a page, and then do it again 3 months after that. This happened, and then pick up the story. The reader doesn't want to be bored with all that any more than you want to bore them with it. But you've established that this was a long, painful process, but we're still moving things along. So the pace is, the story has taken 6 months, but in a page or a page and a half, you've covered it, they get it, and now we're back and we're on with the story.
Thanks, Jerry. And I think that's just, again, guys, you're getting incredibly valuable advice from a 21-time New York Times best-selling author of over 200 books, who's been doing this, if I heard correctly at the beginning, Jerry, right at 50 years since the first book came out. So yeah, happy anniversary, I guess. And y'all take advantage. Get your questions in that question and answer box. And we have a lot to get to, Jerry, so I'm going to dive right in. Christiana asks, would you say that understanding classic story structure was a key to your ability to finish stories as a pantser? Or could you finish your stories before you learned it?
This question refers to the classic story structure, I assume, that has been promoted by Dean Koontz, the great horror writer. He's sort of the working man's Stephen King, worth $450 million just from his writing alone. Not that we write for that reason. I'm not against it, but he's a pretty outstanding, successful writer. And the classic story structure is basically plunge your main character into terrible trouble as soon as possible. Everything they do to try to make it better makes it worse until things look hopeless. And then from what they've learned from all those setbacks, they have tools now on their tool belt. They become heroic. They win the day. I would say that as a pantser, I didn't know this at first. And I wrote a few series before I saw Dean Koontz's thing back in the 80s with the classic story structure in it. And I would say I was a mid-list writer. My series were readable and they were fun and people liked them and they sold. They were doing fairly well. But once I caught on to that classic story structure and realized the ones that worked the best were the ones I had sort of stumbled onto doing it that way. And the ones that didn't were ones where I didn't know that. And so I was just sort of telling the story. And I'm sort of an intuitive plotter because I was raised on television and movies like all of us were. Although because of how long I've been doing this, I mean, when I was born, the Dead Sea was only sick. So, you know, that's how far back I go. But learning the classic story structure did change my life and change my career, because once I caught on to that and started saying, all right, you've got your basic main, you know, even as a pantser, you need to have your main character and a theme and basically where you think you're going. The fun of being a pantser is you're writing as a process of discovery. So you're learning how you get there as you're writing. But you need to have at least that. But then to just have that basic classic structure, get that person in trouble. You know, sometimes I would go 30, 40 pages before I'd really get him in trouble. They might be having some issues, but you know, we're just learning about them. And I'm thinking, well, they need this background and all that. No, they don't. The reader wants to know, what's the story here? What's the challenge, the quest, the journey? What does the character want or need, and how are they going to get there, and what's in their way? That's that classic story structure. So I would say I was a functioning, successful writer before I learned that classic story structure. And now I feel like this has really changed the way I write.
Thanks, Jerry. And we have just several other questions kind of along that same line, but I guess it's about the necessity to put characters into immediate trouble. We have one from an anonymous attendee, but there's several in this vein. Is it necessary to put the characters of a fiction story into immediate trouble? Would it bore the readers if there's a setup that lasts for a couple of chapters?
Yeah, and it would bore readers, right? The setups are almost always unnecessary. We need a status quo. We need a rough idea of who this person is and what they're about, but that can be very quick. And I want to recommend a book, and maybe Tristan can put this link up. The book is called Hooked, and it's by Les Edgerton. And he's a very earthy writer. If you read his novels, you got to read them with your big kid pants on. But this book about writing is a classic. And he basically says prologues and introductions and setups, just get on with it. Now, there is a caveat, though. You don't simply, you know, if I started a book with the hero hanging by his fingernails from a railroad trestle, and the train's coming and people are shooting at him from off the train, he's going to lose his fingers and he might lose his life. You'd read a page or two to see what happens to him. But how much better if I hint at who he is? What if you knew that he was a newlywed or a new father? Now you've got a mother involved in this story somewhere, a child involved in this story. Maybe you find out that he's in a profession where he shouldn't be in trouble. Maybe he's a clergyman. Maybe he's an actuary or an accountant or something like that. And you go, wow, here's a normal guy. What's all the trouble? I often use this example too of a woman who backs out of her driveway in the morning to drive down a mountain to her, you know, to do some shopping. She's got her baby in the back seat, a 1-year-old, and her brakes are mushy on the mountain road. And she's wondering if her husband had anything to do with that. They've survived a little marital issue earlier, but he seemed cold at breakfast. What about that new secretary at work? She has a memory of a tragedy in the driveway of their childhood home when a child got ran over. You just hint at that stuff on the first page. And then when she's losing control on that mountain road and the car goes up on the guardrail and it's teetering, we're not worried just to find out what happens to the mother. We're worried about the baby. We're worried about the marriage. We're wondering if her husband had anything to do with it. So as soon as possible means as soon as possible after you've invested the reader in your character. Give us enough so that we care about what happens to the character more than just that we care what happens in an action scene.
It's so good, Jerry. Thank you for pushing us toward that. And I have a question later about how you've seen that change over the last 50 years. But before we get there, I had a question just about world building as a pantser. how do you do it? Is really the question that's being asked. How do you not outline a story, but still do the world building in a way that's believable for a reader?
Yeah, I think the biggest problem with world building, especially now, if you're writing fantasy and some of these really creative, um, like Lord of the Rings or futuristic stuff that's set in, outer space and all that. Um, I think this applies there too, but the setting becomes such a huge part of the story, and readers expect that and want that. Whatever genre you're writing in, you should be reading dozens of books in that genre so you know the conventions and the expectations. But when I'm writing, I write contemporary fiction mostly or first century fiction. But in either case, I do not make description of the setting a separate element. That's what I think bores readers, and that's what I think slows down the story. If I start with 2 or 3 pages, whether it's first century Jerusalem and I'm describing the dust and the dirt and how far it is to walk and what kind of sandals they're wearing and the robe and it's sweat and all this stuff. It's important to have that, but if it's a separate element, it slows the reader from getting to the story. The heart of the story is what happens to the characters. What do they care about inside? What's their quest? In a contemporary story, the same thing. Let me use the contemporary story as an example quickly. Let's say that you've got your main character driving to a cottage in the middle of the night because he's going to meet with, maybe it's his estranged spouse. Okay, so there's the music of the story. What's going to happen? Now you can establish, whether they've got children, or maybe he's thinking about his daughter, or maybe he's thinking about his son, and you can say whether they're at college or in elementary school, so that we get an idea of how old these people are. But to build the world, that the setting that he's in, I want it to happen while the action is taking place. So the reader isn't even aware of, okay, now we're reading about where this is happening. It's in a cottage, on a cliff, over an ocean, and there's woods around it. There's a gravel driveway. If I stop and describe all that, it's boring. We want to get to the issue. Want to get to the problem, get to the dialogue. Is she going to divorce him? Is she going to reconcile with him? Is she upset about something? Is there somebody else there? Is he going to meet somebody? That's the thing that keeps the reader turning the pages. And while they're turning the pages, I have my character pull up and hear the gravel under his tires. And when he opens the door, he has to hang on to it so it doesn't blow off the car in the wind. And he grabs his hat to keep his hat on. Now he shuts the door, pulls that hat down tight. Now he shoves his hands deep into his pockets because he's cold and he's hunched his shoulders. And he's going up to the cabin. He smells, he feels the wind. He's walking through woods, to get to the cabin, and he can taste that salt air on his lips. We're concerned about who's there waiting for him because we've talked about that while he's in the car and what that's going to be. And that's what the reader's interested in. And they don't even realize they've learned about a gravel driveway, woods, cottage, ocean, wind. It's all part of the action. If you can do that, you won't bore readers. You keep that undertone of tension, what's coming, what's happening, and you've put them in the world that you've built.
And Jerry, I think that leads really well into this next question from Sarah. And Tristan, I'm sorry if I'm throwing you for a loop there. Oh, he had it right away. Look at him, right on the ball. She asks, how have you seen the market shift in your 50 years? Do you consider what's hot when you pick a project, or write what calls to you at the moment?
Yeah, Sarah, that's the difference between being a writer just because you want to be a writer and being a writer because you're passionate and have something to say. That happens. Both happen to be true with me. I want to write. I want to be a writer. But if I just do that by saying, okay, what are the hot topics? By the time the book comes out, it won't be hot anymore, most likely, especially if you traditionally publish. The difference between traditional publishing and self-publishing is traditional publishers pay you. Self-publishing, you pay to be printed. So I always encourage you to exhaust your efforts to be traditionally published first. But how I've seen the market shift, mostly technology has shifted. I mean, back, when rainbows were black and white and I was working on a manual typewriter, we typed our whole manuscript, sent the whole thing in the mail, waited for a few weeks to see how they, now we're transmitting everything electronically. It's sped up the writing process. But as far as what people's attention spans are shorter now than ever. We're in a screen generation. I have a screen in my pocket. I've got a screen on the wall. We've got screens in the movie theaters. We want everything right now. And so it used to be you could write a cozy mystery, settle in, describe the setting. People take their time. Now they just want, give me the story, get to the story. It can still be long. When I read Stephen King, like his 11/22/63, which is about the day of the Kennedy assassination. That's a long book. It could have been longer. I would have loved it because he writes so tight and keeps things moving. It doesn't mean books need to be shorter. Chapters do need to be shorter, a lot shorter. In fact, James Patterson has thrown out the rules for chapters. He's got chapters as short as a few words. Now that's a little quirky for me, but I like the fact that I can write a chapter that's only a scene long. Maybe it's 4 or 5 pages instead of 20 like it used to be. Also with the market, probably 50 years ago, maybe a little longer than that, the classics, when you read the classics, most of them were written with an omniscient viewpoint. It allows the author to be in the heads of all the characters. John did this and said that and thought this, and meanwhile Mary was thinking he's an idiot and why did he say that? And that doesn't go anymore. The few people who can get away with that do everything else perfectly. So the story really grabs you and you're not even aware that they're head hopping into different people's minds. Nowadays, you want one perspective character per scene, preferably per chapter, ideally per book. I like to write a novel where I'm telling the whole story from the perspective of one character, whether it's first person or third person. You're limited to them as your camera and your recorder. And you might wonder, how do you get to know other characters then? By how they interact with that character. He might be thinking, she said that, but she sounded like she might not believe that. Or she said that, but he told me that wasn't the case, that she really didn't like my new car, and she said she did. So she might be a liar. That's how we get to know the other characters from the perspective of one. So lots of changes, but good question, Sarah.
Yeah, and Jerry, I wanted to just note, I think a lot of times people jump on these webinars and we have something to offer them at the end that's more of a sales pitch for one of your products that really helps people continue journey in their writing. But we've been intentionally trying to do months of learning over the past 2 months. We had software and platform last month through some free webinars. And then this month, Jerry, you're doing not only this live repair and rewrite session for manuscripts, but you're doing a webinar coming up at the end of the month called 5 Qualities That Separate Successful Authors from Wannabes. And we're just trying to, again, provide that valuable content that teaches you guys what's current in the writing industry. And Jerry has a great perspective, having been in the industry over the last 50 years. But what's current now, what's going to get you to the top of that pile, and how to write better, really, is what it comes down to. And so we'll continue to answer a few more questions, but Tristan just dropped the link for that in the chat box. Be sure to check that out. Again, 5 qualities that separate successful authors from wannabes. That'll be at the end of this month. Just another free session for you guys. The other thing, Jerry, people have been asking about, that book is Hooked by Les Edgerton. Here it is. And we are going to drop the link for that in the chat as well. So Tristan, if you want to drop that too, that talks about hooking the reader from the get-go. And one of your recommended books on writing, Jerry. As we dive back in, I want to get to this question about backstory, because it feels like a lot of the people who are here today are struggling with pace. And so they're asking, not from world building to dialogue, how do you keep that pace from a long transition in the character? And the question here is simply, what about backstory? How do you do backstory and keep that pace up?
Yeah, backstory is sort of the new term for flashbacks. And the cliche with flashbacks, the reason they've fallen into despair, is that you always have a character that either dozes off on a train or a bus or somewhere, or daydreams, and then they imagine this scene that happened, years ago, and you write that out, and then they're jarred back to the present by the conductor or the bus driver saying, this is your stop. That's the cliche. What I like to do is simply, if I'm writing along and I've hinted at the backstory, we hint at backstory in contemporary fiction the way we learn about it in our own lives. If you've got a friend and you both went through a trauma, let's say that you were at an amusement park in Cleveland 6 years ago and someone fell off the Ferris wheel. That's a trauma. That's a horrible memory. When you get together or when you go to an amusement park again, you might have a conversation, but you want, if you're being realistic in a novel, people tend to say, as they were walking up to the amusement park, they thought about what happened in Cleveland 6 years ago. And when they saw somebody, you're telling this whole story. In real life, they would say, boy, I hope we don't see anything like we saw in Cleveland. And the other one might say, yeah, it's been 6 years and I think about it almost every day. Now the reader knows intuitively, we're going to find out what that was. But in realistic dialogue, they're not going to spell it all out. They were both there. They both experienced it. It traumatized them. And so as the story goes on, maybe somebody else comes on the scene and says, I can't believe you're here because you told me what happened, 6 years ago. Did that girl die? Yeah, matter of fact, she did. She fell from, this height. So now we're getting a few details. Now, at some point, if you need to spell out exactly what happened, you simply start a new chapter, and the flush left italicized date and location tag says Cleveland 6 years prior, and they tell the story in real time. And that keeps the tension, it keeps the pace. Now, as far as, I'm going to go a little bit further than just flashback. People are talking about how do you keep the pace when in a novel all the way? How do you keep people turning the pages? Because you can't have all action scenes and shoot 'em ups and car chases and fights and that type of thing. You need to have some tension and anticipation literally on every page. I use the word literally very carefully because literally means actually. It doesn't mean like I literally died when I heard that. Really? Why are you still here? Every page, I want to have some sort of hint or setup or anticipation plugged in there. Even if it's just my character saying the next day he would have to go to a dental appointment late in the morning. And after that, he was going to meet his wife for lunch. The reader, again, intuitively is thinking, why are we hearing about that? If this is just a teeth cleaning session, it wouldn't be in here. Something must be going to happen at that appointment. So they're turning the page to find out what it is. Anything they'll anticipate, any setup that demands a payoff. That's the genius of binge watching TV. You ever wonder why we're all doing this? We start watching one of those binge-worthy TV shows, and we might actually think, like my wife and I do sometimes, we're not going to be sucked into this. We'll just watch it, see what it's about, and then tomorrow we'll watch another one. And then at 3 o'clock in the morning, after we've watched 6 episodes, we go, one more, we can sleep in, What do they do to keep you binge watching? It's a series of setups and payoffs. There's a series-long, season-long setup at the beginning, like in Downton Abbey. Will they keep the Abbey? The times have changed and money is short, and can you keep a full staff, and can you keep the Abbey that's been in the house for so many years? And that's going to be answered by the end of the season. But in that show, the first thing is somebody's missing. Somebody was on a boat ride from America to England on a ship called the Titanic, and we don't know where they are now. What happened? That's a setup. Now we know what happened, but we want to see how it plays out in the show. So that's the end of the show payoff for that setup. But there's also a setup before the end of the next commercial. The staff downstairs, 2 people are flirting with each other. Do they both get it? Does one realize the other one's really interested? And what will happen there? So there's setups and payoffs that are continually being set up and being paid off. The more of those you can put in there, the more you'll have readers turning the pages and not feeling like, oh, this is a downtime. As I say, it doesn't all have to be fights and action scenes. It can simply be that undercurrent of tension. What's going to happen?
That's perfect, Jerry. Thank you for just diving into that question. I know pace is such an important part of fiction, especially today, and nonfiction for that matter. We have one more question I think that we have time for, and in the next 5 minutes, it comes from Karen. Karen asks, "I'm concerned I may have too many characters." I did that to Tristan. I shot him the wrong question to end with. So sorry about that. But here we go. "I'm concerned I may have too many characters in my first chapter. Although I've been told it reads well, I'm concerned professionally it might not look good. The characters are there for dialogue, a nurse, a doctor, former in-laws, along with my main character and the antagonist."
I would agree. That's too many characters. The reader's going to feel like they need a program to keep track of who all is there. It sounds like it might be a hospital scene, and hospital scenes often are heavily populated. I think you can simply say that, but keep the attention on the main character. So let's say I'm called to the hospital because a loved one has been injured, and I don't know if they're alive or dead, or if they're in deep trouble, or if it's just a minor thing, or if it's going to be surgery. When I get there, other family members are there, cops are there, doctors, nurses, etc. You can just say that. Walked into this cacophony of noise, people talking, and so keep it on one person. I wouldn't, if you say that there's lots of family members there, or if you feel the need to say which family members, I wouldn't name them. It's the naming of characters that makes the reader think, I'll never remember all these people. And also, anytime you name a character, that makes them important. And so make sure they're not just an orbital character. They're going to have a place in the rest of the book, and give them some sort of a tag. Are they a chain smoker? Do they talk fast? Do they stutter? Do they have a limp? Something that when you see that name, you go, oh, that's the one, so that they're differentiated from each other, distinguished. The reader can keep them in mind. But again, if this is a hospital scene and I'm the main character going to find out what happened, I'm going to go straight, if it was my family, I would go straight to my wife and I would say, what's happening? What happened? What's the doctor saying, et cetera, et cetera. And then if a doctor needs to come in, or if a nurse needs to say something or do something, they can do that. But I don't have a big list of characters to keep track of. I just know there's a crowd there. But the music of the scene is what's happened and how that impacts the main character, especially internally.
Yeah, and Jerry, thank you so much. Thank you for taking the time to just jump on, do a couple of these manuscript repair and rewrites that we usually reserve for guild members, like we mentioned at the top. It's so helpful. And guys, we're going to post these on Jerry's Facebook page and on his YouTube channel as well, so that you can have access to this. If you want a recording, feel free to reach out to wecare@jerryjenkins.com. And Tristan, I apologize. There were two Karens that we had questions from, and I told him the wrong one. So that's on me. But we have enjoyed having you guys. Again, at the end of the month, we're going to have more live and free training from Jerry Jenkins. That's going to be the 5 tips, or the 5 qualities, excuse me, that separate successful authors from wannabes. Be sure to sign up on that with the link that we've provided in the chat. And we will see you then. Jerry, thank you so much.
Thank you, Chase. Thanks, Tristan. Enjoyed
Bye,
it.
guys.